On the second day of the major conflict in the Middle East, the war between Israel and Iran, we can only talk about the further deepening of confrontation and escalation of the conflict, which may now also create conditions for the involvement of new participants. Iran is warning the United States, the United Kingdom, and France that if they help Israel evade Iranian attacks, military facilities of these countries will become targets for Tehran. As is known, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France have so far assisted Israel in countering Iranian attacks. This was the case during the first major attacks by Iran on Israel. Now we have heard similar commitments primarily from the United States and France, and there has been information that the Americans already tonight helped the Israelis to counter the rocket attacks from Iran. Of course, if Iran attacks American military bases in the Middle East, this could become a rather serious element of further confrontation in the region involving the United States. And President Donald Trump will be forced to make a decision about his country's participation in a major war. But Iran may choose a different path, one that is much more cautious in terms of the possible reaction to American involvement. For example, US facilities could be shelled by Yemeni Houthis. However, the United States has reached an agreement with the Ansar Allah organization, which is yet another Iranian proxy army, that the Houthis will not shell American military bases and ships. But we understand that in the context of this major war, the Houthis could simply abandon their commitments to the United States under pressure from Tehran. And Iranians could provide the Houthis with an even larger missile arsenal for strikes both towards Israel, which is currently less relevant, since Iranian missiles are already being launched at Israel and towards American military targets, including the aircraft carrier Harry Truman. Another important intention of Iran could be to block the Strait of Hormuz, which in principle could create quite serious problems for the global economy, reduce the supply of oil to world markets, and drive fuel prices to sky-high levels. This would also serve the interests of the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, who at that moment would become the main supplier of oil to countries such as China and India, and would be able to significantly increase prices for this much-needed resource in times of crisis. And this would also mean increased Russian activity on the Ukrainian front, which could not go unanswered if not by the United States, which is increasingly reaching a dead end in its own foreign policy, then at least by Europe. There are already civilian casualties. The Israel Defense Forces emphasize that Tehran is now completely within range for Israeli strikes, and therefore the Iranian Ayatollahs should think 3 times before firing at residential neighborhoods in Israeli cities. But Ayatollah Khamenei and his inner circle have a completely different approach to the matter. First of all, as we can see, they are firing at residential neighborhoods in Israeli cities, and in fact, their actions are aimed at terrorizing the civilian population who may come to doubt the effectiveness of their own air defense system. From Tehran's point of view, this would be its indirect victory in the first stage of the war. And in Tehran, according to reports from Israeli sources and satellite images, the Iranian army is now deploying missile launchers directly in residential neighborhoods of the Iranian capital. Why? So that Israeli army strikes on these missile complexes could kill as many civilians in the Iranian capital as possible. It's quite simple. Iran needs images of civilian casualties from Israeli bombings. in Tehran. They saw how attitudes in the West changed after October 7, 2023. In the first days after the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel, and let me remind you that this attack was also organized by a decision of the Iranian political leadership, which coordinated the terrorists' actions. The majority of sympathies in the world, even among some Arab countries, were on the side of Israel's civilian population. But as soon as Israel began its operation against the terrorist organization Hamas, and photos of civilians from the Gaza Strip who died during this operation appeared in the media, public opinion quickly shifted in the opposite direction. Pro-Palestinian demonstrations began. We can talk about a serious surge of anti-Semitism around the world, including in countries like the United States or the countries of the European Union, which could have been considered allies of Israel in its fight against terrorism. Now, this is exactly the effect the Iranians need to achieve. They see that even those politicians and public figures who oppose the continuation of Israel's operation in the Gaza Strip understand the necessity of Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, because they realize what a danger it would be if Iran, which is prepared to destroy neighboring states, including Israel, were to become a nuclear power. But as soon as the situation shifts toward numerous civilian casualties, public sentiment will change as well. And Iran is counting on achieving yet another so-called moral victory over the Jewish state, precisely by killing its own compatriots, as well as intensifying waves of anti-Semitism around the world, especially in the United States of America and the countries of the European Union. All the more so because the groundwork for such intensification has already been laid by months of fighting in the Gaza Strip. So it can be said that Israel and Iran are now fighting for completely different objectives. For Israel, it is important that Iran abandons its nuclear program, although it is still unclear how realistic such an approach is given the capabilities of the Islamic Republic. And perhaps the issue is simply about slowing down Iran's efforts, since it could resume uranium enrichment after Israel's military operation ends, especially against the backdrop of demands to stop the harsh treatment of Iran's civilian population. And Iran needs to tarnish Israel's reputation so thoroughly that it cannot be restored after this war. And the more Iranian civilians die from Israeli bombings, the greater the Ayatollah's desire for further confrontation with the West will be, and the more real their chances of maintaining their own power become as the population consolidates around the country's leadership, which is trying to protect them from brutal airstrikes. And the situation in the Middle East and the world as a whole will become even more complicated, even if it is possible to achieve a cessation of hostilities in the coming weeks, which for now also does not seem likely. What does seem likely is that this war will escalate into a regional conflict with completely unpredictable consequences for other arenas of military confrontation around the world, first and foremost for Russia's war against Ukraine. Thank you, friends. Stay tuned to this channel, subscribe to it, follow me on my social media and on my Patreon channel, Buy Me a Coffee, Donatel. This all help support and develop these resources. Make use of the sponsorship feature right here on YouTube. Victory. Good luck.